Good afternoon. Heavens, that's loud, isn't it? Good afternoon and welcome to the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values last Tea and Ethics seminar of this semester. And those of you who've just been through midterms, can you believe it? We're getting ready to move into Thanksgiving, Christmas, and sayonara. I can't imagine that. I know, I saw that applause. Believe me, we applaud too, and it's okay. If you have not been to a Tea and Ethics before, I have some things to tell you. If you have been before, then you can look around while I'm saying this, because I had some people tell me, you know, you really ought to record that because you say it every time. But it seems to help all of us understand why we're here. My name is Claudia McCullough, and I'm the director of the Jackson Center for Ethics and Values. Let me tell you what we really want to do in our center. We want to start the discussion. We want you guys to leave here talking about what you hear today. We can't give you all the answers, but we hope we can help you framework the questions. We hope we can help you go to that computer, go to that research center, and learn more. So we hope that this is the beginning of your learning process. And indeed it is for me, so I hope it works for you. We're always excited about what we're doing here, and today is no less exciting. But before I introduce our presenters today, a couple of house rules. Number one, please, my dear friends, look at those cell phones and cut them off. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. Number two, you are committed in here to an hour. I will call time at 5:30, and those of you who must leave may leave. We frequently have most of you stay because we're still in the midst of a discussion. But I'm very old-fashioned about manners, and I think it's inordinately impolite for you to leave while someone's speaking. In fact, I don't want you to. So please do not do that. If you feel like you're going to leave, go now. But you're committed now to this hour, and I promise you it will be an hour you will not forget. So let's get started, having said that. I am so excited about today, and you may or may not know that these kind people, well, sometimes I chase them down the hall. Sometimes I appear in their offices magically. But they really do this because they too are excited. This is volunteer. They do it because they want to share their excitement with you. So, let me share my excitement with you about who they are. Sitting here on the stage is my colleague and friend, Dr. Phil Schneider. Dr. Schneider is an emeritus professor of philosophy. He's been here at Coastal for lots of years, and now he's retired, and he takes care of a lot of turtles on Pawleys Island. He also takes care of the environment. He also starts boards of ethics at hospitals. In other words, Dr. Schneider is a man who believes in what he has learned, and he practices it. Now, no less than Dr. Schneider here is my good friend Dr. Dan Abel in Marine Science, but also the director of the Sustainability Center. I always say about Dr. Abel, Dan is the man who walks the walk and talks the talk. And that's not always easy, but I absolutely applaud him for that. So I'm going to turn this program over to both of them. Here's how we do. One will present, the other will present, and then we'll have discussions. So while they're talking, think of some good questions to ask them. Don't let them get by without answering your questions now. And at 5:30, I will say to you, it is 5:30. Those of you who have to leave may, and you'll be surprised how many of you will want to continue to stay. Sorry, one more house rule. If you run out of tea, you can get up and get some more. We really want you to enjoy this tea and enjoy this afternoon. So I'm going to turn the program over to these two. For those of you who just came in, come on down, let's clean your seats. Come on down. Don't stand, we really want you to be comfortable. And by the way, these, if you haven't been in the recital hall before, there are little tables that pull up and pull over. But we need to take care of the recital hall. You're very kind to share this with us. We're supposed to be singing while playing these wonderful drums here. Dan and Phil, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. Dave, is the sound okay back there? Thanks all for coming. I'm going to sort of try to set the stage here. The really important stuff here Dan's going to cover. But I want to try to provide a framework because you see the title here, If Trees and Polar Bears Could Talk. Well, they can't talk, obviously, but some ethical principles can speak for them and on their behalf. And that's what we want to talk about here today. This might make this work. I think I'll just do it this way. I always start with ethical theory. Everybody has an opinion about a moral issue, whether it's in medicine or in business or the environment, no matter where it is. We've all got our opinions, and of course we're all entitled to our opinions. The problem is that not all opinions are created equal. And in order to be able to make sense out of difficult ethical or moral issues, I personally think it's very important to start with a basis of a set of ethical theories, with which you may or may not agree, but at least they are a roadmap for guiding discussions on moral issues. If there's any hope for objectivity in morals, and there's some controversy about that in the discipline, the objectivity can only come from general principles, the same way it does in physics and chemistry and marine science. You put your observations, your data in the context of general principles, try to make sense out of them. Okay, that doesn't work. This always happened to me. Most of the ethics that you may be familiar with and probably studied if you take Philosophy 305 or a course like that, Introductory Ethics 102, starts with ethics focused on human interest and human needs. And those are, as you know, called anthropomorphic ethics. That is, they are human-centered. And they come in a number of varieties, but generally they can be classified into three sorts of theories. The first, perhaps the best example of Immanuel Kant, talks about the intrinsic value of human life. That we don't have to defend our value, we automatically have it. And so we need to accommodate that and act in such a way as to recognize that intrinsic value. On the other hand, human welfare is important, and not just humanity, but human welfare for the most people we can achieve it for. And so we have a brand of theories called utility theories that look to maximize benefit for human beings. Not everybody wins necessarily, but focuses on maximum benefit for each individual human being involved. Another sort of theory, human-centered again, communitarian theories look at the human individual in the context of the community's interest. And it may be that actions need to be taken for the benefit of the community that might from time to time be detrimental to specific individuals. Now, one thing that ought to be clear right at the beginning here, that these aren't the same kind of theories, that they can conflict with one another. And when you're faced with a moral issue, these theories may give different directions about what to do, how to decide it. And so you have to go through a process of resolution, figuring out what the resultant position is that you want to take on a given moral issue. Those of you who may have studied physics know about vector analysis, where you have forces acting in various dimensions and directions. Which direction is the body or the particle going to move? It's going to move in what's called the resultant direction. The resultant is the result of a number of forces acting on the body. Well, moral decision-making is very much like that, I believe. That is, you have a set of moral principles that give you guidelines and guidance in various directions, like vectors, and in specific situations, you have to make a decision about what you think is the right thing to do. But these ethical theories can help you do that. But human-centered ethics are not the only kind of ethical theories. There's a set of ethical theories that apply in a broader sense than just beyond humanity, although they apply to humanity as well. And we might call these world-centered ethics, the ethics of environmentalism. Humans have rights. Humans, we think, we're apex predators in the biological sense, so we can prey on anything that we wish in our planet, and we do. But we're only one sort of life, and higher level life. Animals have their interests, and Some think that animals have certain sets of rights. We can talk about that in some of the case studies. A broader sense than just human and animal rights, though, is a respect for life wherever it occurs. In our biosphere, humans are, of course, alive, animals are alive, mosquitoes are alive, plants are alive, bivalves in the ocean are alive. And so a bio-centered sort of ethic would place some sort of value on every kind of life. And that means then that we don't necessarily take life if we don't have to. On the other hand, we do have to on occasion. If we want to eat, you've got to kill the carrot to eat, just like you got to kill the cow to have hamburger. And so, life competes with one another. That's the nature of it. Even broader than just the respect for life, wherever it exists, is the recognition that we live in the context of systems. Ecological systems of various sizes and niches. And we disturb those systems all the time. If we disturb them, obviously it would be nice to know how we're disturbing them and what the resultant might be from that disturbance. The most broad perspective environmentally is something called holism, which looks at the whole Earth as basically an intersecting sum of, or resultant, you might say, of various ecosystems operating together. So we've got human-centered ethics, we've got environmental-centered ethics. Go back to the idea of a resultant, that is, when we have a conflict involving the environment, humans involved, environmental features are involved, animals might be involved, global warming might be involved, then what's the right thing to do? Well, consult our theories and see which ones come to bear and what the resultant is in our own minds about what judgments we should make. Now, one sort of judgment which has been made very frequently and since the Industrial Revolution of the early 1700s are decisions made based on economics. Adam Smith, the founder of the modern economic theory, still applies, still operates. And we've operated according to this economic theory when we intersect with the environment. The most heavy intersection with the environment, of course, are individual humans. We exist within our environment surroundings, but also corporate existence and corporate decision-making, and specifically corporate use and misuse of natural resources. And so what's the bottom line of business, of course, is money, is dollars, economics. And so corporations make decisions about how well they're doing in their operations, sometimes based on cost effectiveness, as you see there. They say, are we doing things right? Look at our manufacturing process. Can we streamline it? Can we make it cheaper? Can we move offshore and save labor costs? Can we invest in sweatshops and reduce our cost even further? We just make those decisions not based on human ethics necessarily, but our ego interest in maximizing profit. In a broader sense, business looks at the cost-benefit of its operation. Are we doing the right things? Now, again, you see I underline cost here because the basis for answering the questions are money, and the dollar is the bottom line. And so we say, are we doing the right things? The word right here means profit. It doesn't mean necessarily right in a broader sense, where we are concerned with the holistic ethic involving the environment. So most often, up until the last 35 some odd years, decisions have been made corporately in terms of profit. And so the dollars then compete with whatever value an environmentalist might see to an environmental feature, like a polar bear or a forest or a clean river or an ocean full of fish that we can use for human benefit. It's all about profit, and the value there then is measured in dollars. What do you think happens to an environmental feature who has to compete with dollars? If you're a polar bear on a melting ice cap, your economic value is not very much. But your environmental value might be very high in terms of species diversity and continuation. So you see that's the sort of issue that arises with economics. Now, we can solve some of these problems and put a framework for environmental decision-making if we link up human ethics, anthropomorphic ethics, and environmental ethics, world-centered ethics. And the link there is through the idea, a little bit broader than was originally proposed for human ethics in terms of utility, because we all need the environment. We all need clean air, we all need clean water, we all need to be able to grow crops, we all need to be able to have animal food, and we all need to continue to exist. And so the environment allows us to do that, and if we disturb and even destroy the environment, it's not going to be useful for humanity. So the utility link, I think, is the way to sort of look at the resultant issues morally when we're faced with environmental issues. And Dan's going to talk about a number of those issues in just a minute. One way to do that, though, is to recognize Garrett Hardin was an agrobiologist and wrote an article called what was it? Tragedy of the Commons, thanks. And he defined the term called carrying capacity. And every biologist knows that there's a carrying capacity to every environmental feature. The carrying capacity is how much the environment can stand before it is destroyed. If we're thinking about a river, how much can we put into the river before it is destroyed in terms of any human practical use for fishing or for potable water? So every environmental resource has a carrying capacity, and it's finite. And global warming is a good example of that. The Arctic ice sheets are not infinite in terms of their ability to regenerate themselves every winter. And it's not happening anymore, so something's happening to them. If we care about our generation, and certainly our future generations of humans, this is human-centered ethics talking, then we'll pay attention to environmental ethics. We'll use natural resources because we have to survive, but you use them in a way that Dan's going to talk about, in a sustainable way, which means we get what we need, but we don't take more than we need. And we care about the future of the resource. Most importantly, in terms of the resultant process I talked about, of bringing moral principles to bear, different dimensions, and deciding what the direction is we want to go in, will involve not dollar versus values, but value to value comparisons. Now, dollars have value, no question about that. There is economic value. But environmental features have value also, and they're not necessarily linked to dollars, although they may be. Dollars compared to environmental values, what happens to the ecology and the diversity? Who wins? The dollar wins. You can see that on Wall Street today. That's what's happened. We don't have dollar values we can put on environmental features very readily. So we ought to be doing a moral comparison or trade-off or resultant process, as I mentioned, not looking at the dollars versus environmental value, but the value of dollars. Now you see the first part of the comparison I advocate here is looking at the moral value of maximum short-term profit, which is the focus of economics in Wall Street, at least currently, along with the environmental degradation that comes with that maximum short-term profit. I'll give you an example, a case example of that in just a minute. So do we think that's a high value? The competing value is the value of profit. We need it. We have to have profit. Business won't exist. Our economy won't exist without business. So we need to have a profit, a long-term profit, and it may be less in the short term, but more in the long term. At the same time we have a long-term profit, it's possible, and you'll see examples, where we can have a sustainable ecology and, again, maximize human welfare. So we get a value, you see value here underlined twice. It's a value versus value trade-off, not a dollar versus value. So what's the value of the dollars? The moral value of the dollars with the environmental impact. Let's look at an example. Most of you have probably heard of this example. Out on the west coast in Northern California on the coast, a real thin strip of coastline about 40 miles wide. There's an area of old-growth forest. Old growth means it's never been cut or forested. And the old-growth forest there is comprised of redwood sequoia trees and some Douglas firs. Redwood sequoias can be as old as 3,000 years. Most of them are in excess of 300 feet high. Think of the Washington Monument in Washington is 550 feet high. This is a tree 2/3 as high as the Washington Monument. At their base, they can be 20 feet in diameter. There's one sequoia in a national forest called the General Sherman tree which in the 1920s I carved a road through it. Some of you may have seen that. It doesn't hurt the tree's still living, 3,000 years old, but that's how big they are. So they can provide a lot of lumber for building. Well, in the early 1970s, I said up until 30 years ago, we'd had really no effective control of business degradation of the environment. Congress stood up and said, no, we do care about the environment. And not just because it's useful and because it has economic value, but because it has intrinsic value. We care about it. We care about the diversity of animal species. Obviously, we care about human welfare. We care about preserving artifacts like old-growth forests that can provide human sort of understanding of their place in the universe. So Congress passed 4 laws, have been amended a number of times, but the National Environmental Policy Act, and it's a cautionary act that says before you do anything affecting the environment, you got to tell people what you're going to do, and you got to estimate what the effect you think is going to have on the environment. So it has to be a public statement of what you're going to do and your estimate of the impact. It's called an environmental impact statement. There's nothing to do with it. You have to do the statement, but that's all it is. It's a required statement. The Endangered Species Act says, Congress says, we care about species. We have a process a biological process to identify species that are endangered, whether animal species, plant species, bug species, whatever. And we care about the species, and before we destroy them or act in such a way as to threaten them, we stop and think about that. And we try to balance the value of that continued species versus the value of the environmental effect that's being proposed. The 2 other acts that are important are the Clean Water Act, administered by the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Clean Air Act, administered by the Environmental Protection Agencies. You see an intersection of a number of principles here involving natural resources, air, water, animals. Now in this area in California, this example, these old-growth redwood sequoia trees provide potential for enormous economic value. A wildcat speculator in 1990 became aware of this old-growth forest. It was owned by a company called the Pacific Lumber Company. It was a family-owned company, over 100 years old in 1990. And they were busy logging selectively in the forest, cutting, not clear cutting, but just cutting trees enough to sustain the company's profit. A fairly small community of about 400 people, self-contained up there, of loggers, and really not bothering anybody and very happy with what they were doing. The speculator did his own analysis of the 14,000 acres and found that it was significantly undervalued as far as the value of the stock in the company was concerned. And so he proposed a takeover. The family finally agreed to it. It was sort of semi-hostile. And he bought the whole thing. And he began to put out environmental impact statements involving clear cutting. And he figured in about 12 years they would all be cut down, all 14,000 acres. Well, the environmental impact statement identified several species. You've probably heard of the spotted owl, but there are several other bird species that are endemic to that redwood forest, and thought, at least at that point in the early 90s, that was the only habitat that would support them. And so environmental interests who didn't want the clear cut to start with found a hook in the environmental impact statement of the endangered species, and a sufficient hook to go to court, and the judge in the court stayed the company from harvesting any lumber, and until the court could examine the issues in light of the endangered species there and the Endangered Species Act. That court process was cumbersome and slow and ran about 3 years. And a number of other proposals were made to cut just the trees that fell down naturally, and there were some issues around that. So basically the company wanted to maximize its profit, and the environmental interest didn't want anything to be touched at all. And of course we had polarity there, and you can't go either way to win. And so even to the point where the environmental interests, some of the more intense interests, were entering the forest and driving iron spikes into the trees, spikes about this long, And so that when loggers went in to cut, their chainsaws would hit a spike and flip the chain off the saw and whip around, and it was really dangerous. Likewise, when the lumber was shipped to a cutting mill, it would damage the circular saws in the cutting mill. So not a good situation, and really a standoff in the mid-1990s. Neither side winning. The company finally realized that it wasn't getting anywhere, and it wasn't making any money, it wasn't cutting anything, and that there had to be some movement off dead center of the polarization of extreme environmentalism on one side and extreme profit on the other side. Remember the resultant process of trying to find moral principles that come together to point a direction for a useful decision, and that actually happened. It was stimulated by the California state and the federal government both agreeing to buy about half of the old growth acreage, about 7,500 acres, and put it into a conservation trust where the only cutting in that area would be to clean up the trees that died naturally, which always happens. These trees are 2,000 years old. They're dying. They will eventually die. But they are old growth, and they will be there for another 1,000 years, some of them. Another part of the dimension of this decision was a habitat conservation plan. The company agreed not to log on the steep slopes where stream beds would be affected by extreme runoff. When the trees were gone, they were holding soil that would otherwise run down and to spoil the streams. The company agreed to a sustained yield plan, think of sustainment here, that they will be cutting in their forest here for 100 years. And they will be making a nice profit, not a maximum profit, not $6 billion, which is what the original evaluation was, but they will be making probably in the neighborhood of $2.5 to $3 billion over a 20 to 30 to 50 year period. And that represents a 1,000% increase over the price they paid for the property. So they're not maximizing profit, but they're earning a great profit. And that's part of the decision. So you see here that if we go to value trade-offs, what's the value of profit, maximum profit with environmental destruction versus good profit, long-term profit with sustainable resource management, it's possible to get a win-win situation. I'm going to turn this over to Dan for some of his case studies, and what I would invite you to think about in each of the cases he talks about is how you might resolve the issue he talks about by looking at a number of environmental and ethical principles that might intersect together and provide a resultant sort of analysis about what's the right thing to do here. Okay, Dan.
Thank you, Phil. We have to change clothes here. Slight irony here. We're in the midst of the biggest budget cuts Coastal's ever had, but we have to wear 2 microphones. Okay, can you hear me? I want to thank Claudia, first of all, for inviting us for this important subject, and also for having durable ceramic mugs back there. Although I swear on the phone call when she invited me, I heard beer and ethics. I didn't hear this is the bad cop part of the good cop, bad cop talk. There's no way of avoiding the bad news, and if we were all in a trial, the judge would have to find us all guilty, and I'll explain why as I go. First, multiple choice test. Since the overwhelming majority of you are here because of your own free will and nobody's requiring you to be here, I thought I'd give you maybe a quick test. If the trees and polar bears could talk, they'd be ignored like most of the world's voiceless. They quote John Donne, that's from my English colleagues here. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, right? If you kill a tree and a polar bear, you're taking a little bit of humanity away too. They'd speak for cows, pigs, and other victims of animal factories that provide the food that we eat. This is the last one's even more cynical. The trees would accept their own demise if it meant more student parking, strip malls, and subdivisions, and the polar bears would acquiesce to their fate if it meant more stuff for Americans. I've been accused of being a cynic. My next 2 slides are going to set the study of ethics back and probably negate all the good that Phil did with his talk. I look at this very simply. There are two futures out there, and we need to choose which one we want for ourselves, and we need to act to achieve it. An entire planet at war over resources like energy and water. I guess I could read it right here, couldn't I? Hundreds of millions of refugees from rising sea level, a sick natural world characterized by mass extinctions, dead or dying ocean, catastrophic failures of our food system, collapse of the world economy, and hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. A recently released report on global climate suggests indeed that that's the trajectory we're heading in. It may not be an unimaginable future. This is the one I think if we took a vote, most of you would agree with. A planet powered by readily available renewable energy sources, solar and wind, where we recognize that nature is not an amenity, but it's our only life support system. Where we have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Where ecosystems exist, but we recognize that we do have a need for a human landscape, and they coexist with each other. Sustainability is about economic and social justice and not just environmentalism. And so in this future where large-scale injustices and poverty no longer exist and we have world peace. I mean, I think those are two very clear choices. So here's how my remaining 15 or 20 minutes are going to go. I'm going to tell you the bad news about the state of the environment. You've heard it before. There's going to be a PBS show tonight on Frontline, I think, on global climate change. I'll give away the answer to who is responsible. It's us. Then we're going to talk about what we should do about it and why aren't we doing it. And I think that's where maybe the field of ethics comes in. And I'd like to hear from you all when we get to that point. Virtually every indicator of our planetary health is in decline. Here are some global and, because what happens globally affects us, local issues. Top of the list is planetary climate destabilization, global warming, the planetary climate emergency. All of those are synonymous with each other. We don't use the term global warming anymore because what we see is more extremes in temperature and weather patterns, and some parts of the planet won't, in fact, warm. But the net effect is an increase in the planet's temperature. It's probably a national security issue unlike any that we have, equals or surpasses that of nuclear terrorism. We're seeing declines in biodiversity. About a third of the planet's biodiversity is in 1% of its surface area, and it's declining. We have mass extinctions, 100 extinctions today, 1,000 extinctions today. We don't know. We know we're getting extinctions. Fish stocks, 70% of fish stocks are at or over their maximum exploitation levels. We're seeing ecosystems that maybe in perhaps the following generation or 2 generations from now will disappear. If you've never been to a coral reef, I would go. I wouldn't drop out of college. I'd wait till the semester's over, but I would go see a coral reef. It's something that is one of the most threatened pieces of landscape or seascape on the planet. We have problems with water availability and water quality. 20 years ago when I was getting my education or first teaching, the most important environmental issue was topsoil loss. Not a very sexy issue, but it's still an important one because we need topsoil for our food production. And now we have to deal with global trade that's bringing invasive species over, not just kudzu, but lots of marine organisms that we're finding in Chesapeake Bay. There's something called the veined wrapper whelk that came across from Singapore and the bilge of ships carrying international trade. And it established a foothold in Chesapeake Bay, much to the chagrin of clam farmers. It's not only that direction. Invasive species from our waters are moving across in the opposite direction. We have local environmental issues as well. Many of you aren't full-time residents here. Georgetown County is largely a rural area. It's being rezoned now and transparently to aid development of the area. Well, some aspects of development are good, aren't they? We all need jobs. I value mine. But on the other hand, how do we achieve the balance between developing areas that permanently destroys landscape and is in the long-term, not in our long-term interest, versus providing livelihoods for people? CEL is the name of the Southern Evacuation Lifeline, which is a road that's, again, transparently being built to help developers. The PD coal-fired power plant is something I speak out about all the time from the perspective of a scientist and as an activist. We can't afford another coal-fired power plant on the planet, and yet Santee Cooper says that indeed we need another one. Who's right? Who makes those decisions? What do you think about it? They need to hear from you. And there's some others as well. All of these are symptoms of what Phil has alluded to before as the planets, the areas, carrying capacity. How many people this area can support in the long term without irreversibly destroying the natural resources of the area? This is a scary one. This is from a group called Architecture 2030. And architects are among the most progressive thinkers right now in dealing with planetary climate change. The one on the upper left is the one you should look at. That's the Charleston Peninsula. That's my home. I was born in Charleston. And this is after a 1.5 meter sea level increase. Now, when is that going to occur? As a scientist, I can't tell you precisely. I know that the Dutch are preparing for a rise of about a meter by 2050. And that's really a little bit higher than most projections are. But we're talking about maybe the turn of the century, give or take 20, 30 years, maybe a little bit longer, maybe even short. Like I said, I can't say with any certainty. The medical university is underwater. Essential city services are underwater. You can defend against it, but I don't know of any municipalities that have that kind of money. Certainly the federal government doesn't anymore. What are you going to do? Dr. James Hansen, who's one of my heroes, we like to refer to him as future Nobel laureate James Hansen, is going to be speaking in Columbia Thursday evening. Says a warming of more than 1 degree above today's level will make the Earth warmer than it's been in a million years. If we don't do anything to curb those emissions, it will mean an addition of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius this century. That will mean that the new equilibrium sea level that increases because of the thermal expansion of sea level and the melting of land-based ice will be 80 feet higher than today. Myrtle Beach will be Myrtle Reef. He says we have to do, this is now 2 years old, we have to have action within a decade. Now, if we are to avoid the worst impacts, and the worst impacts will be on the people who suffered already, like in recent hurricanes, and impoverished peoples. We all know about this. I hope you know about this. I hope you're getting this in your classes. If you're not, I'm not going to finish that sentence. Hansen said, I refer to large number of coal-fired power plants that China and the U.S. are building. We need to watch that. How is global warming going to affect you? Pick any of these things, and how do they affect your life? Any one of them is going to affect your life. From even production of solar power in the future is going to be affected by global climate change. What particularly bothers me is the subtle effects on ecosystems. This is not in the news. What's in the news is the images of Miami, Florida being flooded. But what about what happens when plants begin blooming early, or certain insects aren't available when birds hatch that feed upon them? What happens when the organisms on which we depend for oxygen, for example, 50% of our oxygen comes from diatoms and dinoflagellates, little unicellular organisms in the ocean. What happens if we see that they no longer can survive? That's an ecosystem service, and there's not a technological replacement for it. I know Phil will probably disagree if I put a monetary value on these services, but people have attempted to. It's upwards of $40 trillion to replace them if there were technological replacements. We don't have that money, and we don't have the replacements. I don't know that I need to go over data here. Does anyone not buy that global climate change is happening, that the planet's warming, and that people are responsible? I'm glad to talk with you because you may not have gotten the right information, but there's little doubt anymore. Let me move on. The scary part is we've already breached the ability of the planet to absorb that extra carbon dioxide that humans are putting into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. We're seeing that half of the temperature increase is already locked into place. If we want to curb it, there's nothing we can do about that much already. We're going to see impacts, and it's going to cause profound changes in every aspect of the environment. Okay, who's responsible? Too many people, using too many resources, since Americans use about a quarter of the world's resources, and we only comprise a little over 4.5% of the world's population. We hold a disproportionate responsibility for that. I always hesitate to put this slide up because it looks like I'm one of the blame us first kind of people, and it's a little bit hyperbole, but the more I look at it, the more I think it should be the only slide I show in this kind of talk. We do nearly everything inappropriately, unsustainably. There's good reason for it, right? Coal used to be cheap and abundant, and nobody knew that burning fossil fuels would be responsible for global climate change. It's responsible for our prosperity. It's provided jobs. There's no denying any of that. There's no denying that we still need coal and oil in the short-term future. We also need automobiles to get around. Had we heeded President Carter's warning 25 years ago, we may not be in the place we are now, but we didn't. But we use the wrong sources of energy. We get around in single-occupant vehicles. We did a study on campus in an environmental science class. About 80% of students and faculty and staff arrived in the cars, one person per car. That may change if we get a bike program on campus. We live in homes that are too big, made of the wrong materials, with indoor air quality that makes us sick. We eat animals that have been tortured their entire lives. We buy way too much, and we buy it from places that don't pay their people living wages. And we waste an inordinate amount. I think you get the picture. I don't know that I need to talk about all these too much. This is the PD Energy campus. Don't you like the nice bucolic setting, the words, an energy campus? This is a Santee Cooper plant that they're going to be putting up, they hope, within a few years. They say they need it for 600,000 new homes in the Grand Strand and for new industry. Well, that's assuming that people continue to build shoddy homes that waste energy and big homes. That could change. With some government incentives, I could design those homes. I'm not even a builder, but I could design homes that use 50% less energy. So instead of building a plant for 600,000, we build one for 300,000. And then if we retrofit other houses, give them more insulation, then we're down to maybe not even a new plant. How do you make those decisions? Okay, let me wind up by talking a little bit about where we get our energy from. You know what that is? You know what that was? That was a mountaintop. That was in Appalachia, a beautiful mountaintop that had on it what coal people call overburden. We call it a forest. So they blew it up, and then they took what they call the valley fill, and they barged it into the valleys, destroying a way of life. There are laws that prohibit doing that within 100 feet of a stream. They used to be ignored. Now, because of a new Bush administration rule, they don't even have to ignore them because the rule doesn't exist anymore. That's where we're getting the power right now to put the lights in this room and to air condition. That's a sludge pond. Frequently they're perched above little communities and schools. And that's the coal at the Granger station where we get our power from. And there's a human cost to mining coal as well. How does that figure into kilowatt hours used? Do we want to talk about how many people get black lung per kilowatt hour? It's one way of looking at it. Okay, how we use land. You fly into Atlanta or Charlotte, you see lots of these little mansions or starter castles, cookie cutter houses, poorly constructed with their sod, a lot of stormwater runoff. National pastime is now shopping. Andy Warhol said, shopping is more American than thinking. I bet you a lot of us have air-conditioned self-storage units because we don't have enough room in our big houses for our things. I think, let me just, well, you know, it doesn't even escape us here. Does anyone recognize that? This, you know, I may lose my job if we have any faculty cuts because of this particular slide, but on the left was a sign that said, coming soon, exciting new sports arena. I didn't see a sports arena there. Did anyone else see something else there? I saw a forest. I saw something that contributed to the aesthetics of our campus. I saw something that we should venerate and be role models to students by keeping as it is. So that other sign was the one I thought should be there, already here, providing essential ecosystem functions for free, maintaining campus biodiversity. I'm not sure too many people agreed with me on that. And, you know, we're entertaining ourselves to death. 2 excellent books. So I think, why don't we stop my presentation here? I don't know that it merits clapping. It's not a happy kind of presentation. I get depressed when I give it. But let's open this up to questions if you have any. What should we do and why aren't we doing it? Or any clarification questions for Dr. Schneider or me?
Why can't we do that here?
Well,
These farmers can't go tobacco anymore. Why don't they put wind turbines?
Excuse me, Jane.
yes.
Repeat the question.
Okay, the question is,
David stated.
okay, the question is about wind turbines. We actually have an expert, Dr. Gaze, on campus that is working with some researchers at other places to study that very question. We could put the wind fields in South Carolina onshore are probably not good enough. The cost-benefit analysis isn't in favor of wind turbines yet. Offshore, there's enough wind to power all of South Carolina needs, and unfortunately, the infrastructure for all of the components doesn't exist here. It's in Europe. The ability to even construct them, the right kinds of ships aren't here, and the regulatory mechanisms to study the environmental impact and to even deliver the power, those are still being worked out. Look for offshore wind turbines in Delaware first, and then ultimately working their way down the coast, maybe in a decade or 2. Yeah.
I have 2 questions, and they're very different, so I'm not sure if we want to address them. So the first question has to do with what I perceive to be maybe an internal contradiction between what Dr. Schneider was arguing and what you were arguing. And that is just about the nature of our values. And I guess what I was hearing is that we sort of have some value trade-offs that we're supposed to be making regarding profits, regarding intrinsic value of nature, extrinsic value of nature, our own practices. And yet, the second part of the presentation seemed to say that our values are bad and wrong, and we need to change those. So how can we have a cost-benefit analysis that takes into account our present values? It sounds like we need to change those, and that's a good question. My second question has to do with our kinds of solutions that we come up with these kinds of problems. Every time you think about environmental ethics issues, it seems that you always run up against a collective action problem. That is to say, it's not me as an individual that is the problem, but it's our society that's the problem. And if you make the majority of people change, well then it's easy to free ride, right? I can still maintain my lifestyle and make everybody else change. How do you change that way of thinking? I guess my question is, can that be done in the private sector, or do we have to rely on government?
Great question, Jelena. Why are we burning coal? We need energy, right? Why are we burning dirty coal? What do you think? Cheap. So we've got a political problem that says, how much do we care about the environment? How much does the reality, which is certainly there, of global warming contributing to it? And what are we willing to pay to fix it? And so if we take a wider cost benefit and do a value to value kind of trade-off, which is what I'm arguing for, then what's the value of short-term profit of dirty coal versus a long-term benefit and some cost to improving technology for coal burning, which can certainly be done. I'll give you an example where we can harness the economic interest to the environmental interest. That coal-fired plant is putting out sulfur dioxide, SO2. SO2 combines with H2O water in the atmosphere and produces, guess what? H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid. So we get acid rain. Now, what can we do? We don't want to put so much sulfur dioxide. Why? Well, it's cheap. The cheap coal has a lot of sulfur in it. So one thing to do is to say, okay, you want to put out SO2, that's okay. We'll set a limit on how much SO2 you can put out your stack this year. If you go over that, we'll fine you. And we'll say to anybody else who can come in and put out less than their allotted amount of SO2, we'll give you credit. And so Company B, who cleans up its act, can sell credits to Company A, who hasn't. Now, that doesn't mean the SO2 level is going to go down overall, but it will not go up. Now, the SO2 cap and trade program is endorsed by the EPA, and it's working very, very well. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being paid by companies who still pollute. The coal-fired plant down here at Wynyah Electric Station south of Georgetown is the dirtiest coal plant in the United States. And it's also one of the newest ones. And why? They're burning cheap coal from West Virginia. So they're buying all kinds of SO2 credits, but now they're saying, wait a minute, you know, it's cost us an awful lot of money. It might be cheaper to put scrubbers in to reduce our level. So the economic interest works in favor, in tandem with the environmental interest. So it's a value-value kind of comparison, not just profit. I think that answers hopefully your first question.
Yeah, I mean, in addition, you wonder, maybe we should just stop using less energy. Then we wouldn't have to worry about building another power plant, right? I mean, isn't that what Dan's suggestion is?
Lots of things that Dan talks about certainly are possible to do. I think we've got a political problem here. I don't think the government currently it cares about it. It certainly doesn't care enough about it to do anything about it, or do enough about it. So we need public action. We need public response. We need people to make noise. We've got a congressman. We've got a representative government. They're just not hearing enough from people who care enough. In the 1970s, Congress cared. They passed these laws, and it's still on the books, although some of them are not being enforced the way they should be. So I say it's a grassroots campaign.
I'll just add to that. I don't know that our values are entirely wrong. At one point in the distant past, it was okay to act the way we're acting now, but times have changed. There are over 6 billion of us now, and there didn't used to be, with every one of them wanting to lead the same lifestyle that you and I live. And under those circumstances, we have to change our values. There's an excellent book out by a conservative scholar that's just been published about 2 months ago called Limits of Power. Do you know that book, by Andrew Bacevich? He argues in a bipartisan, very logical way that post-Jimmy Carter's presidency, the American mantra has been more and more and more, and that American profligacy has gotten us into our military adventures overseas, our demand for bigger houses, big SUVs and Hummers, and no politicians have the courage, Democrat or Republican, independents do, to say we can't continue to grow. Right? It's inconsistent on a finite planet to have exponential growth continuously.
Dan, I want to stop us right here for just a minute. First of all, I want to thank you for all of you here. We're really excited. I hope you'll stay. I hope these two, you mind asking me 3 more questions?
Sure.
You two? Okay. We always take in our seminars. They're available for checkout in the Jackson Center. They're cataloged through the Kimball Library. So if you would like to look at this again, or to meet these professors who like to use it in your class, I hope everybody got the rest of our schedule. Please stay and we can talk some more. But I always promise you that on the hour, I will tell you. If you need to leave, you're welcome to. You're also welcome to stay. So, wait, let's applause.
For those of you who are going to stick around for a few minutes, let me pick up on one point Dan made and pose a question to you, and it's a moral question. We have a lot of people on this planet, 6.5 billion. China has about 1.4 billion. India's right behind. China cares about its population problem for various reasons and has installed a political process called One Child. You may have heard of it. And it's rigidly enforced, no longer by forced abortion, but it's rigidly enforced in the workplace. China is a communist country. Any venture capital in China has to have a 51% Chinese board of directors. And so they enforce the One Child at work. You bring your kid to work, and they give you good child care at work. Have a second child, to cut your salary 25%. Third child, another 25%. Is that effective? Yeah. Now, in the United States, we have absolute reproductive freedom. And I have to tell you, my wife and I have 6 children, so I felt pretty free. Should I not have had 6 children? So what are the political implications of saying, well, we got to have a 2-child policy in the United States? We reinforce children in the United States in a mild way through the tax system. You get a deduction or an exemption for each child under the age of 21, I think it is, who are dependents. So I get $3,000 a year for each child. That's $18,000 exemption off my income when they were all dependents. Should we have that exemption? It tends to increase the, in a mild way at least. Nobody has kids for a tax exemption, I doubt, but certainly encourages it. And should we maybe change that and do it in a public forum kind of discussion way? That's one of the hard issues. It's a political issue. It's also a moral issue. Obviously, you can see the way around, the way to resolve it, and that is to do it. And look at the ethical principles that apply. Let me ask you a question. Anybody in favor of influencing fewer children in the United States?
Incentives or, I mean...
Incentives, yeah, sure. Is that politically saleable?
I can support incentives.
Such as?
Like you're saying, let's face it, our society does give you great incentive to have children, whether you're rich or poor. If you're poor, you get more welfare money. If you're rich, you get more, as you said, more tax exemptions. So certainly, at least, maybe not setting up a penalty, but at least taking away some of the incentive.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Maria?
This is a question for everyone. I suspect many people here are wondering why Coastal doesn't have a greater practical commitment to the green campus. I know there's a philosophical commitment, it's part of the strategic plan, but what can students, faculty, and staff do, and what's our ethical obligation to, in our daily lives, to create a greener campus, as well as to advocate for a greener campus and convince the administration and the people who control the purse strings here at Coastal that this should be priority over, well, start naming all the other.
Okay, so the question basically is, what can we do to reinforce our desire for a greener coastal with the administration? I'll let current employees answer that.
There are a number of reasons that we don't have a bigger commitment. I think the administration is moving in the direction, given limited resources, to make that commitment. We just hired our first full-time sustainability coordinator, a former student, Marissa Mitzner. If you don't know Marissa, you might have to take a number. She's one of the most popular people on campus, but she gets things done. Former President Ron Engel funded the Sustainability Initiative and named me as director about 3 years ago. And he gave me a budget. And that was the first tangible evidence that I had seen that people were beginning to care. We get students from areas that are more progressive. I'm a native South Carolinian. Recycling, there was a land ethic here but little else, and not a progressive area for environmental issues. Locals didn't care as much about it, but we're getting students now from all over the country and all over the world who see recycling in their own homes and their own high schools, and they don't see it at Coastal, and they want to know why. And that, in part, resulted in Marissa being hired. part of the problem is resources. Facilities management now they're responsible for all recycling on our campus, so the overwhelming majority of it. We're taking some of that responsibility. We do it on game day and move in working with them. They don't have enough people to fix air conditioners on campus, and so it was an add-on, and it was a responsibility of the housekeeping staff, the lowest paid people on campus, to do recycling. That, for many people, is the indicator that a campus is moving towards sustainability. We've talked with the president and the provost about getting a hugely increased bike program on campus. We've asked the president to sign the president's climate commitment, which would move us in the direction of climate neutrality on campus, involving faculty and staff and students working together to develop a plan and to implement that plan. His advisors urged him not to sign initially. I think we're going to revisit that, and I think there's a good chance that he will sign. He's been very sympathetic to sustainability on campus. I'm not sure that with all the financial exigencies and other issues on campus that this reached their radar screen and is important to them as it is to us. But I think it will be as long as you all keep the pressure on them.
I want to speak to what you said about the grassroots movement, Bill. I took a train trip this weekend. It's really fun. I love traveling on the train. And I was eating a sandwich and said to the man running the club car, "Where's your recycle bin?" And he said, "Oh, we don't recycle." And I went, whoa. Wait. You're telling me all of Amtrak doesn't recycle? And he said, "Come here." And I went over and he said, "We've been trying to get it." And he said, "A friend of mine who worked for Amtrak wrote an ugly letter. I don't think he works here anymore." And he said, "Could you write a letter?" And I said, "Oh, you better believe it. I'm going to write a letter." And he took me to the garbage can. He said, "Look." And I looked down, it was full of cans, full of cardboard, and he said, "They make us throw it in the garbage." And I got so upset. But he was such a nice man, and he worked there, and he said, "Unless passengers start demanding it, we're never going to get it." And I do think there's a power in grassroots movement, but I also think we're extremely complacent. As long as my belly's full, and as long as my body's cool, then I'm okay. And I really think we have to get rid of that and start doing this kind of thing. And you know what? With computers, it doesn't take you long to write a letter. And I've already sent two. Go for it. Write Amtrak. But just that one incident, and the man was so frustrated. He said, "I can't lose my job, but I think my friend did, and so if you passengers are going to have to do it." And that's grassroots.
Yeah. And let me add one more thing, too, because in order to get my sustainability coordinator, the first time I asked for one, I didn't get it. And so I figured out a very clever way to do it. I advertised for a sustainability coordinator linebacker coach, and they gave me 6 of them. That's partially tongue-in-cheek, but like it or not, the football program was done right. They put the resources into it, they hired the right people, they got community support for it, and it's working. We have arguably a far more important task on hand. I'm only a part-time director of sustainability. They basically give me a course reduction and some summer money to do this, and now we have Marissa working full-time. But we have a job the size of the football programs, and I think the football program has maybe a dozen coaches. All these players, we have the 2 of us. We've got a group of committed students known as eco-reps. We've got a number of other students that are volunteering. We have the human resources, and as long as these budget problems don't result in cutting the sustainability initiative, and maybe you might want to let that be known to the administration here, we will make incremental gains. And fast enough for me? Not at all, as you can tell. I think we should drop everything. Every professors should talk about global warming, should talk about how to live a reasonable life. If you graduate from Coastal and you don't know your place in the world and you don't know how to live a reasonable life, and even as a business major, if you don't know practices of sustainable development, If you don't understand why we can't continue to build coal-fired power plants, then maybe you should ask for your money back, because we failed you. Charmaine and then Dennis, yeah.
Dan, I know that I heard today that our building projects on campus will still be funded and going to go forward. I hope that you will be implementing some level of leads in each of those buildings. And also, could you speak a little bit about what other things Coastal can do in the near future to help us be more sustainable?
Okay. LEED is the standard for green buildings. We wrote a LEED policy before the state passed one, and the faculty senate unanimously passed it. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, and because of that, any new construction on campus will be LEED certified at the middle level, which is silver or above. Monday we're going to be interviewing architects for the Science Annex, Science Building Annex. It'll be a green building. So all buildings on campus should be green. What can we do on campus? We can have a culture of sustainability such that any action that we take on campus, we look through the lens of sustainability. When we order new carpet, for example, something as mundane as carpet, we don't want carpet that is going to degas formaldehyde, which is a class 1 carcinogen. There are companies out there that can lease you carpet tiles that you can replace, and it costs less up front to do that. Why don't we do that? Likewise, furniture. We should have furniture that doesn't imperil the health of students in the classrooms. Landscape. We don't need everybody. We don't need these people that work in the physical plant using these leaf blowers that are deafening to their own ears and putting hydrocarbons, other pollutants into the air. We don't need all the turf. We could use native landscape. Aramark, for example, now is doing the right thing. They've gone trayless. They're trying to do sustainable options. Their hands are tied in some places, but on some campuses, Aramark is incredibly green. They're moving in that direction. Purchasing, when we should be using nothing but 100% post-consumer recycled paper in every office. We're going to be trying to put together some sort of sustainable practices guide for offices to use on campus. So, every aspect. Marissa initiated game day recycling. We hadn't been doing that. We were throwing away all the aluminum cans and glass and plastic bottles every week. Now that's not being done. She did cardboard recycling at move-in. Again, diverting 3 tons of cardboard from the landfill. So, change the way you look at things. I mean, that's my advice to students. So, I tell my students that you have a right, if a professor hands out a test on virgin paper, to hand it back and say, my policy is I do tests only on recycled paper. Why not? What's the worst that's going to happen? You flunk the test, you make a point. If the class did it, what would happen? We change that practice. I mean, I'm all for subversive activities, and we need to change our whole culture of consumption on the campus. Do you want to add anything to that?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, Dennis.
There is this objection to any of these improvements that are suggested, whether it's offering recycling in places where it's not, whether it is building a more environmentally friendly home, or buying a car, or rebuilding, any of it. And the objection is that, look, this will just cost more.
Well, again, I come back, as you know, I spent 30 years in Washington as government executive, and it's a political problem. It's a problem of will, and it's a problem of leadership. Unfortunately, in the last 8 years, you haven't heard a presidential proclamation about environmental care. In fact, a number of regulations have been loosened and weakened, and even abolished. So it starts at the top with a commitment and an awareness, and you keep hammering away at it. The processes to do this, as you say, are there. In the long term, they're probably cost neutral. So why is the short term all that important? Why does it automatically get the highest value? And I think that's the mindset that we've got to change. It's automatically the highest value because we've just been doing it for 250 years. But now we say that's not necessarily the highest value. The other values are high also. And then we say, okay, you're going to build a new building? Let's do it right. Let's pay the cost, and that's a dollar cost. In the long run, there's an environmental value saving. See what I'm saying? So you push it back on the values track, not the dollar track. You're right. Dollars are going to govern unless we make the trade-off visible.
I think part of the answer to the question is first, there's a myth that doing the right thing costs more. And that's not necessarily the case. You see it with a lot of environmental choices. And unfortunately, some do initially cost more. The Green Building Council has been very successful with implementing LEED because they've been very smart about showing that first costs are at or only slightly above conventional first costs. And then over the long term, as Phil says, they're far reduced. But the other aspect of it is we've got to move towards, and I'm sure you knew this before I answered, to true cost pricing, right? The cost of electricity is 8 cents a kilowatt hour here. I had somebody tell me that in Annapolis, they re-regulated electricity, removed some of the cost controls in an attempt to conserve. The price went up substantially, and then people began conserving, and they built in some protection for poor people, obviously, who can't afford for electricity to go up. We should have tiered pricing, for example, for electricity, so that everyone's allowed, enough for basic needs. But beyond that, if we're going to waste energy, we should pay more. But a gallon of gasoline, when we paid $4 a gallon for it, that was not an unreasonable price. It was unreasonable profit for the oil companies. It was, but if part of it went for the true cost of oil, for the human health problems, for the road building, for the wars that we fight for oil, then the cost might be $8, $9 a gallon, and we might use less, and then we might find that we don't need to fight wars for it, and we might develop alternatives, etc. Yes.
Back to the campus here. I don't know, you talked about the football program, and I don't want to get into that. I'm not a big sports fan, but I just see, my pet peeve is these, what I refer to as smokers' prisons. And when I was told, and I have no idea if it was accurate, but when I was told what it cost the campus to have those things put up, and yet something as simple as, for instance, there's 2 parking lots on either side of this building. They're both marked for faculty and staff. For the cost of a $100 sign, you could turn that into a parking lot for vehicles rated high efficiency. You can turn it into a parking lot for carpools. Lord knows the parking problem on this campus. Every year I read almost bragging that we've added 1,400 students this semester. Well, how many parking spaces did we add? We didn't add any parking. It's not, even if you don't look at the environmental sustainability of it, you cannot sustain a growing student population without a growing place to put their, I don't get it. And like I said, and when I see things like spending money on gazebos, rather than simply enforcing the regulations that they already have about smoking near entrances to buildings and what have you, or littering, I heard that one of the complaints was, there's cigarette butts everywhere. Now there's only cigarette butts all over around the gazebos, and I guess that makes it a little easier to clean up. But the whole point is that before you could write somebody a ticket for throwing a cigarette butt on the ground. I know it. I don't get it. It seems to me like the priorities here, like everywhere, are really pretty screwed up.
Yeah, I could validate what you said, but if you want to add something. No, I agree. I mean, you know, our resources are allocated in ways where I in charge would be very different. The parking issue is one that the administration is working on. They recognize that not only does it not make sense to continually, we can't afford to build parking spaces and parking lots, but that's valuable real estate that we could be using for other things, right? We could unpave it and make the campus more aesthetic. We could put permeable pavers down. You know, we could make a more walkable campus. There's lots of better uses for a parking lot than for single occupant vehicles. We could have incentives for people to drive, to carpool in. But one of the proposals we've got before the president and the provost is something that I think it was Ripon College just initiated, and that is, or maybe it was College of New England, one of the two. Freshmen are given the option of not bringing a car to campus and given a nice bicycle that they use instead of a car their first year.
That wouldn't work for me because I live out by Dr. Schneider, so that would be...
Well, I mean, and we don't have the infrastructure here yet to do that, do we? I mean, you know, it's not a bikeable campus. It's not a bikeable 544. You know, you take your life in your hands. But you know, there are ways of doing that, ways of raising funds by discouraging driving and using those funds for, you know, for biking. But I agree with your assessment earlier. One or two more questions? Yes.
I was wondering if there are any eco-friendly success stories in the form of big business here and there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's lots of them. In fact, let me tell you, the business community. Yeah. I'm sorry. And you asked me that already. Are there examples of eco-success stories in the corporate world? And the answer is, yeah. There's in America, too many to do. I'll tell you one, then I'll let Claudia tell you one. The company that makes these recycled carpet tiles is Interface out of Atlanta. They decided that their former CEO decided that, he read a book called Natural Capitalism, and it argued that there was no business case for destroying creation. And he looked in his own manufacturing process and said, what could I do to lower my energy cost, to lower my impact on the environment, make a better product, make a profit, and pay my employees better and have the productivity? And he went sustainable. They have factories. Have you gone yet, Marissa? Did you see the factory yet? You're going to go soon. We've been invited to tour the factory. They're carbon neutral. They have a product. To design their carpet products, they sent a design team out in nature and said, how does nature design things? And came back, and now they have a substance that is glueless that sticks the carpet tiles down. One of the problems with carpet tiles is the existing carpets changed compared to the tiles. Well, then they figured everything doesn't have to be exactly uniform. They recycle the tiles. So, I mean, there's tons of examples. Ford Motor Company has one of the greenest manufacturing plants in the world, believe it or not. Green and firm, and they have a green roof on top of it. Did you have, Claudia?
No, I'm sorry, I was waiting until someone did.
Okay. Marissa, any other examples? I mean, there's... Okay.
Over there.
Okay. Also, Sierra Nevada. We started out with beer. Sierra Nevada Ale is a very green company. There's lots of, there are lots of products. If you look at the labels, you'll see that some of them are produced using organic, low impact, environmentally friendly, fair trade, zero energy kinds of things. And I think even I attended a talk by BMW recently, and the corporate vice president, when asked what he most wanted in a new hire, said an understanding of sustainability. Because it's in their own best interests, both in terms of having people prosperous enough to buy their product and saving money. The solar panels, you are probably aware, was a partnership with Santee Cooper. They put 16 kilowatts of solar panels on the bus pavilions. As part of their Green Power program, I subsidize that every month. I pay $30 extra a month for Green Power, and all that money goes back into further Green Power. They'll be doing some wind trials, wind tests offshore here soon. But 16 kilowatts is not a lot of energy, unfortunately. Symbolically, it is. 16 kilowatts is 160 of the old-fashioned 100-watt light bulbs going at the same time. Okay. Solar is still pretty expensive. We're lagging behind, even though we've got one of the best areas in the country for solar. More than Germany, who leads the world in solar production and solar use. Santee Cooper has programs where they'll lend you money to put solar panels on your roof. It's still now at about the $8,000 or $9,000 per kilowatt, and a typical house, a typical American house, which is a large house, would take about 6 or 7 kilowatts. So you can see where it's prohibitively expensive, even with government rebates and state rebates and other incentives. Ultimately, it's going to be largely solar and wind.